An expanded college football playoff has been one of the biggest rallying cries among sports fans for decades. Every other major American sport has placed greater emphasis on its playoff and expanded it over the years. The NCAA basketball tournament expanded to 64 teams in 1985 and is now at 68 teams. The MLB playoffs expanded to 8 teams in 1994 and is now at 12. The NBA and NHL playoffs have been at 16 teams since the 1980s, and the NFL playoffs expanded to 12 teams in the early 1990s and is now at 14. But college football held firm against the winds for an incredibly long time. The sport had no postseason at all for its first 33 years of existence and 46 of its first 47 years, and a single bowl game was as much postseason as any Division I college football team could play for the next 98 years. When it did expand to a playoff in 2014, it had just 4 teams, a system that lasted for another 10 years. Leaders finally agreed to a 12-team playoff going into effect in the 2024 season. But why did such an expansion take so long? What was so different about college football than every other sport? How has its unique way of crowning a champion evolved over the years? Welcome into the History Buffs Hub. In this video, we're going to do a deep dive into the entire history of the college football postseason, from the first ever bowl game to the expanded college football playoff. Before we get started, please hit that like and subscribe button and ring the bell and turn on your notifications. Leave a comment, tell me what you think. History Buffs Hub wants to cover anything history related, from politics to sports to pop culture, but we can't do it without your help. Now let's dive in. To explain a national champion in college football, we first have to look at the concept of a champion. To this day, the NCAA has never recognized a Division I college football national champion. The bowl games are all separate and privately owned entities, and the college football playoff is an event sanctioned by the commissioners of major conferences, and certain athletic directors that select bowls agree to take part in. This is crucial to understand because in every other sport, the league sanctions the postseason tournament to crown its champion. The NCAA even sanctions championships in other sports, but in college football, there is no NCAA tournament or NCAA championship game. It's just the college football playoff national championship, and the CFP is the collection of conferences, teams, and bowls all operating independently from the NCAA. So back to our original point, what is a champion? That concept only carries as much weight as we all put on it. Leagues have in-season tournaments all the time with champions, but those tournament champions aren't necessarily champions of the league in any season. The idea of a championship is much more vague for older sports, and college football is one of the oldest sports in the country still in operation. For context, the first recognized football game between Princeton and Rutgers took place the same year the first ever professional baseball team, the Cincinnati Red Stockings, took the field in 1869. Still, professional teams played unorganized scheduled games against amateur teams, and even as they agreed to play each other, the idea of a champion was a novel concept. There was no champion in baseball until the National League was formed in 1876. In football, the first idea of champions came with the formation of conferences in the 1880s, 2 decades before the NCAA was even founded. Even after the idea of champions began to take hold, the concept of a national champion for college sports made no sense. Different levels of play and wildly different rules across all regions made it seemingly impossible to determine such a thing. Think about your high school for a minute. They may have played for a state championship and in a state playoff, but when that happened, did you ever think about their national standings? Of course not. The same is true for college football. Walter Camp said in 1919 that, quote, "Football is not a game where a great national championship is possible or desirable. The very nature of the sport would forbid anything like such a series of contests as are played in baseball." Beyond just the vague nature of a championship, though, using any sort of postseason to determine it, whether it be a postseason game or a postseason tournament, was even more of a novel concept. League champions through the turn of the century were determined by teams with the best record in those leagues. Sure, the World Series began in 1903, but that was an agreement between the champions of 2 separate leagues. They weren't one entity, and they won their league championships solely by having the best record. The same is true of the Stanley Cup Finals, which existed for over a decade before holding a postseason games to determine league champions in the late 19-teens, and then just had one postseason series to determine the champion when the National Hockey League became the exclusive arbiter of the Stanley Cup in 1927. The NFL began in 1920 and had no championship game until 1933. Before that, it just crowned a champion by awarding the title to the team with the best record at the end of the year. To this day, Premier League soccer, the highest level of soccer in the world, has no postseason to determine its champion. Again, they just give it to the team with the best record at the end of the year, and that was the case for the highest league before the Premier League came into existence, which was the Football League First Division and had begun in 1888. I know this seems like a lot, but it's important to point out that champions, tournaments, and postseason games were all novel concepts for organized sports leagues at the turn of the 20th century, and it's against this backdrop that college football, a sport that was hyper-regionalized and had wildly different rules and styles of play, was evolving. For the first 30 years of college football, the sport operated with no postseason, no official ranking system, and absolutely no consideration of a national champion whatsoever. But over the next century plus, the evolution of a unique postseason in the sport would coincide with its unique way of crowning a champion. On January 1st, 1902, the very first Rose Bowl took place. The game was in addition to the Tournament of Roses Parade, an annual New Year's Day tradition put on by the city of Pasadena, California that began 12 years earlier in 1890. It was organized by the Pasadena Valley Hunt Club, an elite social club in the city, with the goal of showcasing the nice weather in Southern California that still existed in January. Southern California and the Los Angeles area was in the beginning stages of growth as Hollywood would be incorporated a year later, and many members of the club were from the East Coast and Midwest. This was a way to invite their neighbors from those regions out to Cali to enjoy the weather, and in 1895, the non-profit Tournament of Roses Association formed to handle the event. Initially titled the Tournament East-West Football Game, the Rose Bowl game was conceived as a way to fund the parade, and the association would pick two teams, one from the East or Midwest and one from the Midwest or West, who they deemed to be the best from each region, to face off against each other in an exhibition. Since the seasons for every school generally ended in late November, this was never considered to be logged for official record books or anything like that. It was a fun opportunity to draw people from elsewhere to Pasadena and help fund this event they were trying to put on. 10-0 Michigan faced 3-1-2 Stanford in the first Rose Bowl game, and Fielding Yost's Wolverines won 49-0. Because this game was such a blowout, the association abandoned the football game to fund the event the next year. It was obviously going to be a hard sell in the future, so they turned to other events like chariot races and ostrich races. Competitions like polo, tug of war, foot racing, and jousting also became part of the parade. 14 years later, football returned to the parade, and on January 1st, 1916, Washington State beat Brown 14-0. From then on, it became a permanent part of the parade and has played every year since, which is why it's now known as the granddaddy of them all in college football. In 1923, the first Tournament of Roses game was actually played at what is now Rose Bowl Stadium, which opened earlier that season, and that was the first year it was actually called the Rose Bowl. Around this time, rankings began to get more popular. Writers in places like the New York Sun, Harper's Weekly, and Outing had been listing their top teams at the end of each season since the 1890s, but again, there was no officially recognized national champion. Teams began awarding themselves trophies if certain ranking systems recognized them at number one at the end of the year. In 1924, Illinois professor Frank Dickinson developed a mathematical approach to ranking the top teams at the end of every year known as the Dickinson system, and beginning in 1926, the system would award a trophy to its number one team, designed by Chicago clothing manufacturer Jack Rissman. This was the first national ranking system everybody took seriously. A series of other mathematical ranking systems began to develop that carried as much legitimacy as the Dickinson system by the 1930s. Most of the rankings were done before the Rose Bowl game took place, but the teams taking part in it were often the top two teams in the country, so it became the de facto national championship. This entire era is now known as the period of the mythical national championship. In 1934, college football historian Park H. Davis used retroactive analysis to declare every college football national champion dating back to 1869. While there was no official NCAA sanctioned national champion, today's NCAA record book recognizes national champions dating back to that year who finished number one in any three categories of major selectors that evolved over that period. One of 22 mathematical selectors in any given year, one of 13 human polls in any given year, or a retroactive selection by Davis. At the same time, we should point out that in 1920, the Pittsburgh Courier, a black newspaper, began naming black national champions for historically black colleges and universities. The selectors for the black national champions have expanded to a wide range of different black media outlets, from newspaper to radio to magazine to online, and it still exists to this day. The most prominent and long-standing human poll in college athletics began 2 years after Davis' method was introduced. Associated Press sports editor Alan Gold created the AP poll, where he would poll editors of all AP-affiliated newspapers and use it to rank the nation's top college football teams, with the number 1 team becoming a national champion. Controversy was immediate, as Minnesota was 7-1 and finished number 1 ahead of undefeated LSU and Alabama. 9-0-1 Pittsburgh won it the next year, while Alabama, who was a perfect 9-0, finished number 4, and TCU won it in 1938 despite Tennessee, Duke, and Oklahoma all finishing perfect. The other prominent human poll began 14 years later. In 1950, the coaches poll began, in which roughly 62 head coaches, all of whom are members of the American Football Coaches Association, would be randomly selected each year to rank the best teams in the nation. Despite the controversy, because the AP and coaches polls were conglomerate rankings from opinions of people who covered and wrote about the sport, they both quickly and easily became the standard for determining national champions, and teams who finished number 1 in both were known as unanimous national champions. However, let's get back to bowl games for a bit. As the idea of a national champion was becoming more acceptable, the Rose Bowl was still the only postseason game, and it took place over a month after the teams finished playing their regular season games, so no credible polls would ever release a ranking based on that game. Rankings came out when the regular season ended, and that was that. But in the mid-1930s, as the United States was still in the depths of the Great Depression, cities in warm weather climates devastated by the economic downturn saw the Rose Bowl as a model to help kickstart their local economies again. Miami was one of those places, and that's how the Orange Bowl began. South Florida also had good weather around New Year's and attempted to copy the Rose Bowl model in 1926 with what was called the Fiesta of the American Tropics, which was centered around a New Year's Day football game. But while the Great Depression nationally didn't begin until 1929, it actually began in Florida in 1926, as the state had to quickly embrace economic growth and money and credit ran out, so they couldn't afford to put on another fiesta. Add in a series of hurricanes and a fruit fly invasion that destroyed the citrus industry over the next 3 years, and really the Depression just turned the whole country into what Florida already was. In 1932, Miami City greeter George E. Hussey saw bringing back the event as a way to help bring Miami out of the Depression, and he reorganized the event as the Festival of Palms Bowl, in which an invited team would play the Miami Hurricanes each year. That occurred in 1933 and 1934. The NCAA doesn't recognize these games because Miami had an automatic bid that it didn't have to earn, and backers realized that there was a financial advantage to just inviting the best teams possible, so in 1935, they officially invited Miami to play Bucknell in what was the first official Orange Bowl, and a year later, they finally moved away from Miami, inviting Catholic to play Ole Miss. Out west, the Sun Bowl in El Paso, Texas followed a similar bowl model, creating a college football game to promote attraction to the Southwest and spur economic activity out there. Although it featured high school teams in its first year, in 1935, it moved to college football teams in 1936. Also in 1935, the Sugar Bowl finally began at Tulane Stadium in New Orleans, fulfilling a wish that New Orleans Item publisher James Thompson and sports editor Fred Digby had been pushing for since 1927. The Cotton Bowl began in 1937 in Dallas at the Texas State Fairgrounds, where the old Cotton Bowl Stadium is, and was financed by Texas oil executive J. Curtis Sanford. So for a decade, the Rose, Orange, Sugar, Sun, and Cotton Bowls were the only bowl games played, and all 5 are still in existence. A decade later, the US economy was booming thanks to the end of World War II, and with the capital to finally invest, 18 more bowl games cropped up over the next 20 years. 3 of them still exist: the Gator Bowl, the Citrus Bowl, and the Liberty Bowl. Over time, bowl tie-ins began. This was based on attendance factors and reaching agreements over parameters of bowls. The Cotton Bowl Athletic Association took over staging the Cotton Bowl after horrendous attendance to the game in 1940 and then became an arm of the Southwest Conference, giving the SWC champion an automatic tie-in beginning in 1941. The Big Ten and Pac-12, then the Big Nine and Pacific Coast Conference, agreed to an exclusive agreement to send their champions beginning in 1946 to the Rose Bowl because of their agreements that black athletes should be able to play in the game and their commitment to the amateurism of college players in general. The Orange Bowl had a tie-in with the Big 8 champion, and the Sugar Bowl became the unofficial tie-in for the SEC. But against all of this backdrop, bowls were still just fun postseason events, and the national champion came down to the regular season finishes, at least in the AP and coaches polls. That method was literally put to the test the first year the coaches poll began in 1950. Oklahoma finished number 1 as the only perfect team with a 10-0 record, but they lost to Kentucky in the Sugar Bowl. Army finished number 2 but lost to Navy in a game that was played after the final rankings came out. Texas was number 3 but lost to Tennessee, who was number 4 in the Cotton Bowl, and Tennessee was Kentucky's only loss that year, so the Vols do claim 1950 as one of their national title seasons despite no number 1 ranking in the AP or coaches polls. A year later though, Tennessee ran the table after starting the year number 1, as they went undefeated in the regular season and finished number 1 in both polls, the SEC's first consensus national champion. They were ahead of Michigan State, who was undefeated in number 2, and Maryland, who was undefeated in number 3. Tennessee played Maryland in the Sugar Bowl and lost, but the Vols got the major selectors to declare them national champions. Maryland was the consensus national champion in 1953, but they lost the Orange Bowl to Oklahoma. The first split national championship between the two polls occurred in 1954, when the AP selected Ohio State number 1, and the coaches selected UCLA. Ohio State and Auburn split in 1957, even though Auburn was undefeated and Ohio State had a loss. Minnesota was the consensus champion in 1960, but lost the Rose Bowl. Alabama then was the consensus champion in 1964, but lost the Orange Bowl. But around this time, the tide was changing. The advent of television combined with easier methods of travel made bowl games wildly popular and wildly profitable by the 1960s. As a result, greater emphasis was put on them, so the AP finally conducted its final poll after the bowl games in 1965, which ironically allowed Alabama to win the national championship again despite finishing the regular season at number 4 as they beat number 3 Nebraska in the Orange Bowl, and the number 2 and number 1 teams, Arkansas and Michigan State, lost their respective bowls. The AP went back to its old ways over the next 2 years, clearly punishing Bear Bryant's Tide for benefiting both ways in 64 and 65 by keeping them at number 3 despite a perfect season in 1966. But then Notre Dame and Michigan State both went 9-0-1, tying each other, and neither played a bowl game. 2 years later, the AP poll decided to permanently recognize champions after the bowls. But the coaches poll still did it at the end of the regular season. That led to a split national champion in 1970 when Nebraska finished number 1 in the AP poll after winning the Orange Bowl, but number 3 in the coaches poll behind Texas and Ohio State, who lost their bowls respectively. It led to another split in 1973 when Notre Dame finished 11-0 and beat Alabama in the Sugar Bowl 24-23, but Alabama was still able to claim a national championship in the coaches poll, whose final rankings before the bowl had the Tide at number 1. Finally, in 1974, the coaches poll joined the AP poll in recognizing the national champions after the bowls. That 1973 season also saw the first playoff format in college football for Division II and Division III, as both were at 8 teams. The idea of playoffs in all sports were growing, as 4 years earlier, Major League Baseball held its first NLCS and ALCS before the World Series. But Division I college football was resistant. Of course, they would cite things like final exams and the holidays as arguments against expansion, but that made no sense given what the lower levels of football were doing. The truth is that the bowl games held a ton of weight and were extremely profitable. With the bowls now being a deciding factor in the national champion of both major polls, their magnitude and importance would exponentially increase, and they held a ton of weight over conferences and colleges with certain payout promises that rewarded everybody pretty handsomely. Quite honestly, there were traditionalists who had a point too, and, you could argue, had the foresight to know that college football was about to stand alone as the only sport in which regular season games carried enormous weight. Think about the greatest college football games in history. Many of them, including the 2013 Kick 6 in the Iron Bowl, are regular season games specifically because they were effective elimination games. The 1971 Nebraska-Oklahoma regular season game is considered the greatest game ever played, and it was one that determined the national champion of that year. So yes, greed and money of bowls were involved, but they still had a point in resisting the playoff. Anyway, around this time, calls for a playoff in college football grew, and the number of bowl games grew as well. The Peach and Fiesta Bowls began in 1969 and 1971, and the number of bowls went from 9 in the 1960s to 11 in 1974 to 18 by 1990. Split national champions occurred in 1974 and 1978, as Alabama somehow got to claim the AP poll national title despite having the same record as USC and losing to USC head-to-head in 1978. For the next decade after that, the title winner was declared without a hitch, but a series of individual seasons during that time set the stage for a larger conversation about having some sort of designated title game. The watershed moment was 1983. Miami entered the Orange Bowl 10-1 and number 2. Nebraska came in 12-0 and number 1. Down 31-24 late in the game, Nebraska scored a touchdown to cut Miami's lead to 31-30. Tom Osborne had a choice. There was no overtime during this era, so Nebraska could kick the extra point and settle for the tie, at which point they would probably be declared national champions since they would finish 12-0-1 and Miami 10-1-1. But Osborne went for 2 and the win and came up short, so Miami won 31-30. That game created an appetite for more 1 versus 2 matchups in bowl games, one that only grew when the opposite happened the next year. BYU finished 13-0 and won the national title, despite not playing one team that won more than 8 games or finished in the top 25. They beat an unranked Michigan team in the Holiday Bowl, leading to an extremely anticlimactic finish to the season that was such a letdown compared to 1983. Every national champion from 1985 to 1988 won a number 1 versus number 2 or number 1 versus number 3 bowl game, but in 1989, number 2 Miami won the title by beating number 7 Alabama in the Sugar Bowl because undefeated and number 1 Colorado lost the Orange Bowl. Then came 1990. Colorado and Georgia Tech split the national championship, with Colorado finishing number 1 in the AP poll at 11-1-1, largely thanks to a 5th down on accident by the refs in their win over Missouri, and Georgia Tech finished number 1 in the coaches poll at 11-0-1. Everybody with eyes knew these were far from the 2 best teams in the sport, but bowl tie-ins and a series of random November upsets had these 2 left standing. Georgia Tech beat a number 19 ranked Nebraska in the Citrus Bowl, underwhelming for a national champion, and while Colorado did win a top 5 matchup against Notre Dame in the Orange Bowl, the Irish were number 5. This incredibly anticlimactic finish, combined with the increasing desire for more desirable bowl matchups, would set the stage for the sport to finally create a national title game. Major schools and conferences did not want a repeat of what happened, so the Bowl Coalition formed and was set to go into effect. The Bowl Coalition was an agreement between the SEC, Southwest Conference, Big 8, ACC, Big East, and Notre Dame, along with the Orange, Sugar, Cotton, Fiesta, Gator, Sun, and Blockbuster Bowls. Bowl tie-ins were maintained, but a bowl would agree to relinquish a tie-in with the number 1 or number 2 team so that team could play the number 1 or number 2 team in another bowl. It would go into effect in 1992. The obvious flaw in the formula was that this coalition excluded the Pac-10 and Big Ten. Given its historic status as the granddaddy of them all, the Rose Bowl never wanted to agree to relinquish one of the champions of those 2 conferences and ever risk becoming an automatic consolation bowl each year. There was also the danger of the game not being played on New Year's Day, which was crucial since it was still part of the Tournament of Roses, and the fact that it could lose its contract with ABC if it entered the coalition. The issue was foreshadowed before the coalition ever went into effect, as Miami and Washington both finished 12-0 in 1991, but Washington was tied to the Rose Bowl where they beat number 4 Michigan. Miami beat number 11 Nebraska in the Orange Bowl, and the 2 split the national championship. Although the Bowl Coalition went off without an issue in 1992 and 1993, that Rose Bowl issue came up in 1994. Nebraska and Penn State were both undefeated and number 1 and number 2 respectively, but Penn State was a new Big Ten member and contractually tied to the Rose Bowl, so they went there, and Nebraska played one-loss Miami in the Orange Bowl. Both Nebraska and Penn State won, and Nebraska was declared national champions by both major polls, so Penn State finished undefeated without a national title. The next year, the Bowl Coalition reorganized into the Bowl Alliance. Again, it included the SEC, SWC, Big 8, ACC, and Big East, along with Notre Dame. Of course, the SWC and Big 8 eventually just became the Big 12 in the agreement in 1996. The Bowl Alliance added the total points in the AP and coaches polls and put the top 2 teams among those into a Bowl Alliance national championship game, which would be the Sugar, Orange, or Fiesta Bowls on a rotating basis. The Fiesta Bowl replaced the Cotton Bowl at this time because the Cotton Bowl stadium was just too old and the writing was on the wall that the old Southwest Conference, which was directly tied to the bowl, was about to go defunct. But again, the Rose Bowl would not give up its ties to the Big Ten or Pac-10. And again, after the first 2 years went off without a hitch, that tie-in created an issue in 1997 when Nebraska and Michigan each finished undefeated, but Michigan was relegated to the Rose Bowl and beat Washington State, and Nebraska blew out Tennessee in the national championship game, so again, there was a split national champion. Michigan finished number 1 in the AP poll, and Nebraska number 1 in the coaches poll. On a side note, 1996 almost saw disaster as Florida State and Arizona State both finished the year undefeated, but Arizona State was relegated to the Rose Bowl, where they barely lost to Ohio State, and Florida State got blown out by Florida in a rematch. So Florida was consensus national champions, but had Arizona State won, they would be undefeated and sharing a title with Florida, who had a loss on the year. Steve Spurrier should thank the Rose Bowl for not giving up on its contracts with the Big Ten and Pac-10 at that time. Otherwise, FSU and Arizona State would have played for the national title the only year he actually won his national championship. But after the 1997 season, the era of the mythical national championship would finally come to an end. Conferences entered another round of negotiations, and this time, the Rose Bowl finally got on board on the condition that they kept their New Year's Day slot. With SEC Commissioner Rory Kramer leading the charge, the Bowl Championship Series was created. The BCS formula took the AP poll, the coaches poll, schedule strength, margin of victory, number of losses, and a conglomerate ranking that involved a bunch of different computer methods to come up with its official ranking. The top 2 teams would play in a designated national championship game, regardless of conference tie-ins, and the title games would operate between the Fiesta, Sugar, Orange, and Rose Bowls. Champions of the Big Ten, then Pac-10, SEC, Big 12, ACC, and Big East would all receive automatic bids to one of the 4 designated BCS bowls, which became the highest caliber bowls, along with 2 wildcard teams. Old conference tie-ins would remain, including the Big Ten and Pac-10 in the Rose Bowl, the SEC in the Sugar Bowl, the Big 12 in the Fiesta Bowl, and the Big East and ACC in the Orange Bowl, with the obvious exception being if a bowl had to relinquish its tie-in for the national championship. For the first time in history, 1998 would see an actual designated national championship game in college football. Controversy almost hit immediately, as the final week of the regular season had 3 undefeated teams, but UCLA and Kansas State lost, so undefeated Tennessee beat 1-loss Florida State in the Fiesta Bowl for the national title. Tulane also finished undefeated, but they were a mid-major, so that wasn't considered a big deal. A year later, there were only 2 undefeated BCS teams, FSU and Virginia Tech, and they played in the Sugar Bowl for the national title, with FSU winning easily. Again, a mid-major went undefeated, this time Marshall, but there was no real controversy. The first real BCS snag came in 2000. Oklahoma finished the regular season undefeated. 1-loss Washington had beaten 1-loss Miami, who beat 1-loss Florida State. However, strength of schedule and computer rankings propelled FSU into the national title game over Miami. OU beat FSU to become clear-cut national champions. In a classic overreaction, the BCS tried to fix the controversy of 2000 by adding the quality win factor and eliminating margin of victory. That only led to another controversy in 2001. Miami finished that year undefeated. A series of wild upsets in the last 3 weeks of the season created chaos. Nebraska was number 2 and undefeated to that point, but then got blown out by 2-loss Colorado 62-36. 1-loss Oklahoma was upset by Oklahoma State that same weekend. A week later, 1-loss Tennessee beat 1-loss and number 2 ranked Florida, and later that night, Colorado upset number 3 ranked and 1-loss Texas. That led to the Vols entering SEC Championship week ranked number 2. But there was another 1-loss team in Oregon, and they were down at number 5. 2-loss Colorado was 3rd, and 1-loss Nebraska was 4th. Tennessee launched the controversy by being upset by LSU in the SEC title. On paper, Oregon had the best argument. Colorado had a decent one too. But 1-loss Nebraska, who had just gotten blown out and didn't even win its division, was propelled into the title game because of Colorado's extra loss, the new quality win formula, and its strength of schedule, which was significantly higher. Oregon beat Colorado in the Fiesta Bowl, and then Miami destroyed Nebraska. 2002 saw Miami and Ohio State matched up with no controversy, as they were the only 2 undefeated teams in the nation, but there was a terrible pass interference call that decided the game, which is where the controversy really was. But in 2003, the exact thing the BCS tried to avoid happened. The season ended with USC number 1 in both major polls and LSU number 2. Both had one loss. Oklahoma, who also had a loss, had just gotten blown out by Kansas State and was the only one of the 3 teams to not win their conference. However, the computers and strength of schedule propelled them and LSU to face off in the title game, leaving USC out. USC still won the Rose Bowl though, and finished number 1 in the AP poll as a result, so while LSU beat Oklahoma to win the BCS National Championship, they had to share it with USC, which again was exactly what the BCS was designed to avoid. By this point though, it seemed clear that the BCS's issue wasn't the concept of a national title game. It was relying on too many factors that don't leave enough up to discretion. None of these controversies were an argument for a playoff. They just saw the wrong team play for the title. To fix that, the formula was simplified in 2004 to be just an average of the AP poll, coaches poll, and computer rankings. But controversy only got worse. 2004 just so happened to be one of those years where 3 BCS teams finished undefeated: Oklahoma, USC, and Auburn. Auburn got left out of the title game despite having the highest ranked strength of schedule among the 3 teams. They won the Sugar Bowl and remained the only team in the post-mythical national championship era from a BCS Power 5 or Power 4 conference to finish the season undefeated and not have a shot at the title. USC absolutely destroyed Oklahoma in the national title, but the Trojans later had to vacate it anyway. For what it's worth, there were 2 more undefeated teams entering bowl season, Utah and Boise State, and while Boise State lost the Liberty Bowl, Utah became the first mid-major invited to a BCS Bowl, beating Pittsburgh in the Fiesta Bowl to finish undefeated like Auburn. On principle, the AP poll pulled out of the BCS after this and was replaced by the Harris poll. 2005 went off with no controversy as Texas and USC finished the only 2 teams undefeated, and Texas won in a legendary matchup between the 2 in the Rose Bowl. Changes were in store for 2006. The BCS went from 4 to 5 games. All 4 bowls would be BCS bowls, but rather than play host to the national title every 4 years, the bowls would rotate to have an extra game each year be the official designated national title game, allowing for 10 teams to go to BCS bowls. This also marked the start of SEC dominance as Florida, getting in controversially, obliterated Ohio State in the national title game. However, Boise State upset Oklahoma in the Fiesta Bowl that year, finishing undefeated as a mid-major, beating a team from a BCS conference. LSU became the first 2-loss team to reach the title game a year later, but blew out number 1 Ohio State. Florida won it again against Oklahoma in 2008 in a battle of 1-loss teams. USC beat Penn State in the Rose Bowl, another battle of 1-loss teams, so USC could say they deserved a shot. And Utah finished undefeated after upsetting Alabama in the Sugar Bowl, generating even more momentum for mid-majors. It all came to a head in 2009 as 5 teams once again finished undefeated just like 2004. Alabama, Texas, Cincinnati, Boise State, and TCU. Cincinnati got blown out by Florida in the Sugar Bowl. Boise State and TCU, 2 mid-majors at the time, were matched up with each other, and Alabama and Texas played for the title. Alabama and Boise State both won to finish the season undefeated. A year later, an undefeated Auburn and Oregon played for the national title, with Auburn winning, but TCU finished undefeated as well after beating Wisconsin in the Rose Bowl. 2011 was the final straw. 1-loss Alabama controversially got a rematch with undefeated LSU, getting the nod to the title game over 1-loss Oklahoma State. Although Alabama won, the All-SEC national title propelled the commissioners to create the college football playoff set to go into effect in 2014. 2012 and 2013 saw no BCS controversies, with Alabama beating Notre Dame and Florida State beating Auburn in subsequent years, and in 2014 the playoff was set to begin. The conference commissioners and Notre Dame came to the agreement for the playoff whereby a 13-member selection committee would rank the teams and the top 4 at the end of the year would play in the tournament. The bowls hosting the playoff would rotate on a 3-year basis, with the Sugar and Rose one year, the Orange and Cotton the next year, and the Fiesta and Peach the year after that. The Cotton Bowl got back into the fold by moving its game to Jerry World in Arlington, and the Peach Bowl, a long-standing bowl of mediocrity, had become extremely well run over the years with the right corporate sponsors and its public presence. By the mid-2010s, Atlanta had become the hub of college football, with the CFB Hall of Fame and the SEC Championship game being held there for 20 years at that point, and with the bowl set to move to Mercedes-Benz Stadium, which opened in 2017, it became a no-brainer to become a CFP game. When bowls weren't hosting playoff games, they would still be designated as New Year's Six Bowls, the new version of BCS Bowls. With the Big East done by this point, the ACC, SEC, Big Ten, Pac-12, and Big 12 designated themselves the Power 5. Their champions got automatic New Year's Six bids, as did the highest group of 5 champion, which was the best team among the other conferences, and 6 wildcards got bids. Among those 12, obviously, were the 4 playoff teams. Now, the SEC and Big 12 champions were tied to the Sugar Bowl, Big 10 and Pac-12 the Rose Bowl, and ACC the Orange Bowl, but as usual, conference tie-ins were relinquished for the playoff. The highest seed in the playoff would get to play in the designated playoff bowl closest to home, and there would be a designated national championship location. Playoff games could be held on the 30th, 31st, or January the 1st, depending on the year and the bowl's hosting. Still, the expansion of teams didn't eliminate the controversy. In the playoffs' first year, one-loss Ohio State entered the weekend ranked number 6 and then leapfrogged TCU and Baylor to get in after a 59-0 win over Wisconsin in the Big Ten title game, despite the other two schools also having one loss. Ohio State did go on to win the national title with Cardale Jones, though. 2 years later, one-loss Ohio State got the nod over two-loss Penn State for the 4th spot, even though Penn State beat Ohio State and won the Big Ten. In 2017, rather than let undefeated UCF in, a one-loss Alabama team that didn't win its conference got the nod and went on to win the national title. UCF beat Auburn, who beat Alabama in the regular season though, so they hung a national championship banner. 10-1 Notre Dame getting the nod over 8-1 Texas A&M was controversial during the 2020 COVID year, and 2022 was an odd year where there were only 2 teams with fewer than 2 losses who won their conferences, undefeated Georgia and Michigan. Honestly, the BCS would have worked out that year, but 2 more teams had to get in, so they put in one-loss TCU and Ohio State, neither of whom won their leagues. TCU wasn't deemed worthy, but then snuck into the national title game only to get blown out by Georgia 65-7. A year later, FSU finished undefeated, but lost its quarterback Jordan Travis in the second to last week of the regular season. That combined with schedule strength kept them from getting into the playoff, as one-loss Alabama and one-loss Texas both got in, with Texas having already beaten Alabama. Undefeated Michigan and Washington were also in. The CFB era has made it pretty clear that you can't avoid controversy by expanding teams. But after all these controversies, the commissioners decided to do it anyway and agreed to move from 4 to 12 teams in 2024. The formula was the same, but the new model took the 5 highest-ranked conference champions, wherever they are from, 7 wildcard teams, and the top 4 teams getting a first-round bye. First-round games were scheduled at the campus or another preferred location by the higher-seeded team the weekend before Christmas. Quarterfinal and semifinal games were scheduled for the New Year's Six Bowls on a rotating basis, and the national championship game remains at a designated location. On the surface, this seems like it would take college football to another stratosphere. The sport is going national again with auto bids, so more teams have something to look forward to, and the buys and home field advantage keep the regular season valuable. But at what cost does this come? They're devaluing the regular season but not ending the controversy. In 2025 alone, Alabama, Miami, BYU, and Notre Dame all vied for 2 available spots. It was highly controversial the way the committee chose Alabama and Miami. Part of what made college football's unique postseason so great was that as championships evolved, every single game became more important for the elite programs. Rivalries were created out of the win or no title magnitude of these regular season matchups. How would we remember the 2013 Iron Bowl if it existed in the playoff era? The college football world stopped when Auburn returned a missed field goal 100 yards for a touchdown as time expired to beat Alabama. That game isn't just popular for excitement. It's popular because it propelled Auburn into the SEC and national title and immediately ended Alabama's 2-year title run with no hope at a second chance for them. And that was all just as a regular season game. If the playoff existed though, it would just be another regular season game that gave Auburn the first round bye over Alabama even though both went. What about the 1971 game of the century between Nebraska and Oklahoma? That's often considered the greatest college football game ever played. Nebraska was 10-0 in number 1 entering the game, and Oklahoma was 9-0 in number 2. The Cornhuskers won 35-31, clinching the Big 8 title, and after beating second-ranked Alabama in the Orange Bowl, being crowned national champions. Since OU won out too, including a Sugar Bowl win over 5th-ranked Auburn, this game literally decided the national championship. But if it occurred today, both teams would still get first-round byes in the CFP, so it would only impact seeding. Effectively, the game would be nothing. Would it still be the game of the century in that case? Is that what we want? Do we really want college football rivalries to be like college basketball, where no matter how many times Duke plays UNC in the regular season, it's irrelevant since both teams are going to the NCAA tournament? And if the answer is yes, because of how many other teams will value the regular season by getting a shot, will those teams' fan bases value the regular season after a few years of seeing just how badly outmatched they are in the playoff? College football is not like college basketball. The sport isn't structured for wild upsets like March Madness. Is an expanded playoff still a worthy goal to increase interest in the sport? Perhaps, but is it killing tradition? Well, yes, Time will tell if it's worth it, but to those whose love of sports doesn't start and end with college football, an expanded playoff like every other professional sport is long overdue. Thanks for hopping into the History Buffs Hub to watch this video. What do you think about the future of the college football postseason? Will it change the sport for the better or the worse? Please tell us in the comments, and once again, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button for more History Buffs Hub videos in the future.